Sign it, Zylah, my mother whispered, her eyes as cold as the Atlantic. Casey deserves the house, the cash, and the company. She's fragile, and you're far too strong for your own good. You don't need an inheritance when you have your intellect. My father pushed the papers toward me without looking up. It's final. Strength is its own reward. Weakness gets the gold. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I simply smiled. A sharp, mysterious thing that made them flinch. That's fine, Mom. Let the court decide whose name is actually on the foundation. The memory of that clinical betrayal was a cold fire in my chest as I stood in the center of the gala. I adjusted my cuffs, the weight of the coming storm settling behind my eyes. The condensation on the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Seaport penthouse blurred the Boston harbor into a gray, smearing mess of salt and shadows. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the sharp, clinical smell of vintage champagne. I adjusted a centerpiece of white hydrangeas, my hands moving with a practiced, mechanical precision. For 15 years, I had been the structural spine of Alaric infrastructure, the one who navigated the jagged bedrock of city contracts while my family preened for the cameras. Yet tonight, in this room filled with the city's elite, I was invisible. I moved through the crowd like a ghost haunting my own success. I caught my mother's eye across the room. Diane was draped in silk, her hand resting delicately on Casey's shoulder as if shielding a porcelain doll from a draft. I waited for a nod, a small glimmer of motherly pride for the 3 massive Chicago contracts I had closed just 48 hours prior. Instead, she looked through me, her gaze shifting instantly to adjust the hem of Casey's designer gown. A cold realization settled in my chest, heavier than the coastal fog outside. True leadership isn't about standing in the spotlight. It's about ensuring the foundation holds even when the world ignores the architect. But tonight, the architect was being treated like a trespasser. "Don't just stand there staring at your glass!" Diane's voice cut through my thoughts, sharp and cold. She didn't hug me. She handed me a silver tray full of crystal glasses. "The investors from the North End are out on the balcony. Casey needs to impress them for her new department. Go make sure their glasses are full." I felt the eyes of our lead foreman, George, on me from across the room. He was older now, his hands scarred from decades of honest labor. He stumbled slightly near the buffet, and I stepped forward, taking the tray from his shaking hands before he could drop it. "Steady, George," I whispered, my voice a calm anchor in the noise. "We are the ones who keep this building standing. Let me handle this." I took the tray, not out of submission to my mother, but out of a deep, abiding respect for the people who actually built the legacy Alaric was so eager to give away. The room went silent as Alaric stepped onto the mahogany podium. The clinking of silverware died a sudden death. My father stood tall, the light catching the gold signet ring on his finger, the ring that belonged to my grandfather. He spoke of legacy, of the Patterson blood, and of the visionary leadership needed for the next generation. Then came the blow that stopped my heart. He called Casey to the stage, crowning her as the sole heir and CEO of Alaric Infrastructure. In front of 200 witnesses, he handed over the deed to the family estate and a $50 million liquidity package. In the heavy silence that followed, Diane pulled me into the shadows behind the velvet curtains. Her perfume was suffocating. "Casey deserves this, Zylah," she whispered, her hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. "She's fragile. She needs the security of the house and the title to feel whole. You were born with a mind that can build empires from dust. You don't need the money. You have your intellect." I looked at the woman who raised me, feeling the sharp sting of the intellect tax, the peculiar way this family punished my strength to subsidize Casey's weakness. "A house is just bricks and mortar, Mom," I replied, my voice devoid of the anger she expected. "But justice, that has a much longer shelf life." I walked away before she could respond. The most dangerous person is not the one who has everything to lose, but the one who has finally realized they owe their loyalty only to the truth. As Casey flaunted the signet ring on stage, her laughter ringing hollow against the glass, I mentally reviewed the succession and competency clauses Stanton and I had unearthed in the corporate bylaws months ago. Alaric had forgotten that a Delaware-registered LLC requires a certificate of operational continuity, a document Casey couldn't even define, let alone fulfill. I watched her, a mysterious smile playing on my lips. It wasn't the smile of a daughter who had lost her inheritance. It was the smile of a woman who had already seen the final move of the game. Alaric approached me after the applause died down, his chest puffed out, looking for a plea or a tear to validate his power. I didn't give him either. I leaned in close, ensuring the firm's senior counsel could hear every word. Enjoy the celebration, Alaric. You've handed her the keys to a kingdom she doesn't know how to rule. That's fine. The court will decide who the true heir is. Before he could find his voice, I placed a hand on his shoulder, a final, lingering gesture of a daughter's fading love. I hope the view from the top is worth the price you just paid for it, Dad. I turned and walked out of the penthouse, leaving my coat behind. The October air hit me like a splash of cold water, sharp and honest. I stood on the sidewalk, my silhouette a jagged line against the shimmering Boston skyline. My phone buzzed in my pocket with a preset digital alert from the main server. Project Phoenix, our largest site, had just flagged an operational red flag. The collapse was starting sooner than even I had anticipated. The morning sun clawed through the heavy velvet curtains of the Beacon Hill estate, casting long, jagged shadows across the Persian rugs I used to vacuum as a teenager. There is a specific kind of silence in an old money mansion, a sterile, suffocating quiet that suggests everything is perfect even when the foundation is rotting. I stood in the doorway of Alaric's study, my boots clicking rhythmically against the hardwood, a sound that felt like a countdown. The air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the overwhelming stench of unearned arrogance. Casey was already there, draped in Alaric's oversized mahogany chair as if she were born to it. She was practicing her signature on corporate transfer documents, her movements clumsy and frantic. Beside her, Alaric stared out the window at the frost-covered gardens, his shoulders tensed. He looked older than he had 12 hours ago, his silhouette hunched under the weight of a decision he was trying to convince himself was right. True wealth isn't what you hold in your bank account, but the peace you keep in your heart when the world tries to rob you of your dignity. I possessed that peace. They were drowning in its absence. I walked to the sideboard and poured a cup of Earl Grey, the steam rising in a delicate, swirling pillar. Despite the betrayal, the habit of care was etched into my bones. I placed the cup in front of Alaric without a word. He didn't look at me, but I saw his aging hands tremble slightly at the sight of the tea. Casey, however, didn't share his hesitation. She sneered, her eyes raking over my simple attire. "You're late for the handover, Zylah. Don't worry, I've already decided your severance. 3 months of pay and that 10-year-old company car you drive. You should be grateful. Dad wanted to give you nothing at all." The words were meant to draw blood, but they hit me with the weight of a feather. I simply adjusted the single file folder I carried, my shield against their storm. Have you ever noticed how the people who do the least work are always the first to claim they deserve the most? Alaric finally turned from the window, his eyes hollow. He pushed a renunciation of claims toward me, the ink still wet. He demanded I sign away any future right to the family trust, to the name, and to the legacy I had personally kept profitable for a decade. Casey chuckled, a sharp grating sound. "Go on, Zylah. You're the smart one, right? Surely you've run out of clever answers by now." A soft, melodic laugh escaped my throat, echoing through the high-ceilinged room. It wasn't the laughter of a victim. It was the sound of a woman who had finally been unburdened. I looked Alaric directly in the eyes, refusing to let him look away. "That's fine. If this is the price of my freedom from this toxic expectation, I'll pay it. But remember this, Alaric. You can transfer a title with a pen, but you can't transfer a reputation. The court will decide who actually owns the future of this name. It won't be settled in this study." I turned my gaze to Casey, feeling a profound, terrifying pity for her. She was sitting in a chair that would eventually swallow her whole. "Casey, I hope you find what you're looking for in that seat. I truly do. Because once the lawyers start peeling back the layers of the Phoenix Project books you just inherited, that chair is going to feel very, very hot." Under Massachusetts law, a signature obtained under duress without a fair disclosure of liabilities is worthless. Did Alaric tell you about the $12 million deficit in the subsidiary accounts? Or did he leave that for you to discover when the creditors arrive? The color drained from Casey's face, her hand freezing over the documents. Alaric's posture shattered, his eyes darting toward the floor. I stood up, the chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a gavel. I didn't sign the renunciation. I didn't need to. I knew the law better than the men who wrote these contracts, and I knew that an empire built on a lie cannot survive the light of day. I walked to the corner of the room where a small desk had been my workspace since I was 22. I began to pack. My movements were slow and deliberate. I found a framed photo of my grandfather, William, standing in front of his first pickup truck in 1965. His eyes were bright with the kind of grit Alaric had traded for social status. I tucked it into my coat, the cold glass pressing against my ribs like a heartbeat. Alaric stood by the window again, his back to me, his shoulders tensed as if he were waiting for me to scream. He recognized my silence from the night before, and for the first time in his life, he realized he had no idea what his youngest daughter was thinking. I stopped at the heavy oak door, my hand resting on the brass handle. Dad, you told Mom that Casey deserves this because she's weak and needs protection. In this family, weakness is rewarded with gold, and strength is punished with exile. I accept my exile, but I'm taking my integrity with me. It's the only thing in this house that isn't for sale. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I had spent 30 years trying to be the daughter they wanted. I was going to spend the rest of my life being the woman I am. Belief is a powerful thing, but the truth is a force of nature. I stepped out of the mansion and into the biting morning air of Beacon Hill. The cobblestone streets felt solid beneath my feet, a stark contrast to the shifting, deceptive floors of the house I just left. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, the engine idling with a low, steady hum. The window rolled down to reveal Stanton, his silver hair catching the light. He didn't say a word. He just held up a heavy, old-fashioned iron key. It was the key to a vault Alaric didn't even know existed. "It's time, Zylah," Stanton said, his voice like gravel and silk. "The 3-week clock starts now. Are you ready to see what your grandfather actually built?" I climbed into the car, the door closing with a heavy, final thud that echoed through the quiet street. The Monday morning sky was a bruised shade of violet, hanging low over the Boston harbor, as if the clouds themselves were heavy with the secrets of the city. I stood before the glass doors of Alaric Infrastructure, the familiar logo etched into the crystal mocking me with its permanence. Inside, the lobby was a cathedral of limestone and hubris, a place I had walked into every morning for a decade. But as I reached for the handle, the air seemed to thin. I swiped my keycard. The small LED light, which had always blinked a welcoming green, flickered a harsh surgical red. I tried again. Red. The digital umbilical cord had been severed. Behind the security desk, Marcus, a man whose children's tuition I had helped organize during the 2024 layoffs, looked down at his monitor, refusing to meet my eyes. He looked ashamed, his jaw tight as he stared at the floor. He didn't have to say a word. I had been erased from the system before the sun had even touched the skyline. I turned away from the glass, the cold wind of the Seaport district whipping through my hair. I needed air. I needed a moment to think. I walked to the small Italian cafe on the corner, the one where I'd spent countless mornings reviewing blueprints. I ordered a black coffee and reached for my personal debit card. The barista swiped it once. Twice. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. "I'm sorry, Zylah. It says declined. Do you have another one?" I pulled out my phone, my fingers steadied despite the cold shock vibrating through my veins. I opened my banking app. Balance, 0. Accounts, frozen. A notification sat at the top like a predator in wait. Access restricted by primary guarantor. Alaric hadn't just taken the company, he had used his legal position on my professional accounts to initiate an investigation for corporate theft, a move designed to paralyze me before I could even find a lawyer. The barista started to apologize, but I simply offered her a mysterious, calm smile. "Keep the coffee. I said softly, my voice as steady as the limestone walls across the street. It's not the drink that matters, but the wake-up call. I walked out back into the biting cold. They believe that by taking my money, they are taking my power. They don't realize that the bird doesn't trust the branch. She trusts her own wings. Wealth is a coat you put on. Character is the skin you live in. I headed back toward my apartment in the South End, my mind working like a high-speed processor. Every block I walked felt like a mile. I reached the familiar brick stoop of my building, but as I touched the doorframe, I stopped. The wood was slightly splintered near the lock. Just enough for a casual observer to miss, but for a structural engineer, it was a glaring wound. The silence of the hallway felt heavy, like a held breath waiting for a scream that wouldn't come. I stepped into my living room and the air vanished from my lungs. My sanctuary had been violated. Books were swept from the shelves, drawers were pulled out, and the contents of my life were strewn across the floor like discarded memories. I walked toward my home office, my heart thudding against my ribs. The desk was empty. My work laptop, the one containing 15 years of architectural schematics, my personal logs, and the digital keys to the Phoenix project, was gone. In its place, sitting mockingly on the bare wood, was a single designer earring, a gold hoop with a diamond incrustation, Casey's signature style. She hadn't just robbed me. She had left a calling card. She wanted me to know it was her. She wanted me to understand that she intended to turn Zylah into a ghost. A woman with no proof of her own achievements. It was as if she were trying to paint over the heights I had carved into the doorframe of this industry. A soft movement caught my eye. My neighbor's ginger cat, Oliver, had slipped through the cracked door during the chaos. He was huddled under the sofa, his eyes wide with terror. I knelt on the floor, the debris of my life surrounding me. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I reached out and gently stroked Oliver's head. "It's okay, little one," I whispered, my voice thick with a terrifying calm. "They only steal what they can't build themselves. They can take the plastic and the silicon, but they didn't take what's inside my head. They can't steal the soul of the work." The silence was broken by the sharp, rhythmic chirp of my personal phone. "Casey," I answered without hesitation. Her voice was dripping with an artificial, honeyed concern that turned my stomach. "Oh, Zylah, I just heard there were some security issues at your place. That's so unfortunate. Maybe if you'd been more careful with our data at the firm, Dad wouldn't have felt the need to freeze everything for your own protection. Just stay away, honey. Stay quiet, and maybe we won't have to press charges for the documents you misplaced." I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply tapped the record button on my secondary device. "You were always better at the theater than the business, Casey," I said, my voice echoing in the ransacked room. "But you're forgetting one thing. You can't lead a company from a stolen laptop, and you certainly can't lead it from a lie." I hung up before she could respond. I realized then that my family was no longer a family. They were a criminal enterprise I had the misfortune of being born into. I didn't call the family lawyer. I didn't call Diane. Instead, I called the police to report the burglary and Stanton to report the corporate sabotage. Under U.S. privacy laws, the seizure of a personal device by a guarantor without a warrant, even under the guise of an internal investigation, is a felony. They thought they were burying me. They didn't realize I was a seed. When the world turns dark, don't look for a light. Be the light. I wasn't losing my legacy. I was simply moving it to a place where they could never reach it. The truth. As I stood in the wreckage of my home, watching the blue lights of a patrol car reflect off the broken lock, I felt a cold, tactical fire ignite in my chest. I stood tall, my silhouette sharp against the morning sun. My phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Stanton. "They missed the safe deposit box. Meet me at the old vault. Your grandfather's true ghost is waiting." I didn't look back at the apartment. I didn't need anything in there anymore. I walked toward the future, the 3-week clock ticking in the back of my mind like a heartbeat. The relentless New England rain hammered against the tall, arched windows of the historic law office, the sound echoing like 1,000 hushed secrets. Inside, the world was a different color, warm amber, mahogany, and the comforting scent of aged vellum and leather. I stood in the doorway, my trench coat dripping onto the polished floor, a stark contrast to the sterile, glass and steel betrayal I had left behind at the Seaport penthouse. Stanton looked up from his desk, his eyes reflecting a dignity that Alaric had long since traded for vanity. He moved with a deliberate slowness, pouring 2 cups of dark tea that smelled of earth and iron. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, unadorned iron key my grandfather had given me years ago. It felt cold and incredibly heavy as I placed it on the desk. Stanton's gaze lingered on it for a long beat before he stood and moved toward a heavy floor safe. He bypassed the digital panels and high-tech locks, pulling out a thick, dust-covered box that Alaric had once dismissed as sentimental junk. My fingers brushed the rough surface of the wood, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt. In a world that builds glass skyscrapers to hide hollow souls, my grandfather had built his life on the solid bedrock of foresight and integrity. He hadn't just left me a name, he had left me a map to find my way back home. Stanton sat back down, a sad but knowing smile playing on his lips as he watched me. "They think they've won because they hold the current bank accounts, Zylah," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "But your grandfather always said, never trust a man who values the fruit more than the root." Alaric never understood that the root is where the life is. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. I finally understood that my exile wasn't a punishment. It was a strategic withdrawal orchestrated by a man who had seen this day coming 40 years ago. Stanton opened the box, the hinges creaking like an old gate, and pulled out a document titled Conditional Trust and Operational Oversight Agreement. It was a legal poison pill, a masterpiece of protective law that had remained dormant and unrevoked for decades. He flipped through the pages with practiced ease until he reached the section labeled Succession and Competency. He tapped a specific paragraph, and as I read the words, the air in the room seemed to vibrate with a new, dangerous energy. The competency clause was clear and uncompromising. It stated that if the company's market valuation dropped by more than 10% within a single quarter, or if a cornerstone project failed under a new successor, the controlling shares would automatically revert. But there was a catch. The shares would only go to the heir holding a master's in structural engineering and a project management professional license. Casey didn't even know what a PMP was. I stared at the ink, my heart thudding against my ribs. I never wanted to take this from Alaric Stanton. I just wanted him to see me for who I actually am. I wanted him to love the business enough to protect it from his own blinding pride. Stanton leaned forward, the light from the desk lamp casting deep shadows across his face. "Casey has already halted Project Phoenix to redirect funds for her personal rebranding campaign," he said quietly. "The market has already reacted. The value has dropped 12.4% since Friday night. The clause hasn't just been activated, it's already the law of the land. We didn't have to steal the company back. We just had to walk into a courtroom and ask the judge to acknowledge that the keys had already changed hands." I began organizing the files, my mind suddenly working with the speed and precision of a high-performance engine. I remembered every line item of the Phoenix project budget, every structural load-bearing calculation I had labored over while Casey was choosing gala dresses. I realized then that Casey's theft of my laptop was actually the ultimate blessing. When she tries to use those files to lead the project, she will be creating a digital trail of unauthorized access to my intellectual property. She is handing us the very rope that will bind her. I looked at Stanton, my eyes sharp and devoid of the hesitation that had plagued me for years. "They thought they erased me," I said, my voice carrying a weight that surprised even me. "They didn't realize they were just clearing the stage for the truth to finally speak. I'm not suing for the money or the penthouse, Stanton. I'm suing to stop a catastrophe. My grandfather built this city to last, and I refuse to let his name be the one that burns it down. True power isn't the ability to destroy or to shout the loudest. It's the strength to stay quiet until the foundation is set. Let them dance in their stolen penthouse and toast to their hollow victories. I am the one who knows how the building actually stays up, and I am the one who knows exactly where the cracks are hiding." That's where it all started. The realization that I was no longer a daughter seeking a father's approval, but a successor reclaiming a legacy. As I stood up to leave, the rain continuing its mournful rhythm against the glass, my phone vibrated in my hand. A message from Diane illuminated the screen. "Zylah, please come to dinner tonight. Your father wants to apologize. Let's fix this as a family." I stared at the glowing text for a long time, the cold lure of the trap as obvious as a splinter in the eye. The Beacon Hill estate glowed with a warm, amber light that felt less like a welcome and more like a gilded cage. I pulled my car into the familiar driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my tires with a sound that signaled my arrival to the predators inside. Diane's text had been a masterpiece of manipulation, draped in the soft language of a mother's regret. I knew the invitation was a lure, a jagged hook hidden in a silk ribbon, yet I chose to walk through the front door anyway. Zylah Alaric was no longer a girl who hid from the dark. I was the one who knew exactly what the shadows were hiding. Inside, the dining room was set with the family's finest silver. The scent of roasted rosemary and expensive wine hung heavy in the air, cloying and artificial. Alaric sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, while Diane hovered nearby, her smile tight and anxious. It was an atmosphere of suffocating politeness, a thin veil draped over a predatory intent that made the hair on my arms stand up. I sat down, my posture as rigid as the limestone foundation of a skyscraper. I noticed two men in charcoal suits standing in the dim light of the hallway. Not lawyers. Their hands were too restless, their eyes too clinical. "Zylah, thank you for coming," Diane said, her voice a soft, fluttering thing as she poured tea. I watched the steam rise in a delicate spiral, but I didn't touch the cup. I watched the clinking of her silver spoon against the porcelain, a rhythmic tapping that felt like a heartbeat. My mother's forced kindness was a profound tragedy, a desperate attempt to protect a pride that had already rotted through. Forgiveness isn't about accepting a lie to keep the peace. It's about refusing to let someone else's darkness extinguish your own light. I looked at her, and for a fleeting second, I felt nothing but pity. Alaric didn't bother with the pleasantries for long. He dropped the facade like a heavy cloak, slamming a thick manila folder onto the linen tablecloth. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. It was a petition for involuntary guardianship. I scanned the first page, the legalese blurring into a singular insult. Erratic behavior, mental instability, and incapacity to manage personal affairs. They were attempting to use my legal retaliation and my theft of company secrets as proof that I had suffered a total psychological breakdown. Diane leaned in, her voice dropping to a chilling, artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Zylah, honey, you've been under so much stress lately. We just want to help you get the rest you need. If you sign this voluntary admission to the clinic tonight, we won't have to involve the authorities. Casey can handle the corporate transition while you recover. It's for the best, darling." The audacity of her betrayal was breathtaking. When they can't defeat your logic, they will always try to pathologize your sanity. I remained seated, my hands resting flat on the table, a stark contrast to Diane's fluttering gestures. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. I simply looked past my mother toward the medical consultants waiting in the shadows. "I hope you were paid an extraordinary amount to witness this," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air like a diamond through glass. "Because in 5 minutes, your professional licenses will be the only things in this room more fragile than my father's ego. You are participating in a felony, and I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." I turned my gaze back to Alaric. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw set in a grim line of stubbornness. "Dad, if you do this, there is no coming back," I said, my voice softening just enough to carry the weight of 30 years of daughterly hope. "I am giving you one last chance to be a father instead of a warden. Don't throw away what's left of your soul just to hide a catastrophic balance sheet. You can't build a future on a foundation of lies and kidnapped daughters." He didn't blink. He signaled the men in the hallway to step forward. The air in the room became claustrophobic, the walls closing in as the two men approached. But before they could reach my chair, the heavy brass chime of the front door echoed through the house. The sound was authoritative, a disruption they hadn't planned for. Moments later, Stanton strode into the dining room. He wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a court-appointed observer and a legal assistant carrying a portable recording device. The clinical silence of the ambush was shattered by the cold reality of the law. Stanton placed a notice of active litigation directly over the guardianship petition. "Good evening, Alaric. Diane," he said, his voice like gravel and velvet. "I believe you'll find that Zylah filed a protective order and a formal declaration of competency with the Superior Court yesterday morning. Under Massachusetts law, any attempt to force a psychiatric evaluation while a civil suit regarding the same parties is active is considered tactical bad faith and obstruction of justice. If those gentlemen in the hallway take one more step, they will be arrested for kidnapping before they reach the driveway." I stood up, my silhouette tall and sharp against the flickering light of the fireplace. I looked at Diane, who was now trembling, her silver spoon clattering to the floor. "You said Casey deserves the inheritance because she's weak, Mom," I said, my voice steady and unyielding. "But you tried to label me insane because I am strong. Strength isn't a symptom. It's a survival mechanism you taught me by never being there when I needed you. You made me this way, and now you have to live with the result." The room was silent now, the ambush neutralized by the very thing they had tried to steal from me, the truth. I looked at the dinner I hadn't touched, the cold rosemary and the bitter wine. I realized that my presence in this house was a chapter that had finally reached its end. I didn't need their approval to be whole, and I certainly didn't need their permission to be sane. The girl who sought her father's love had died in the shadows of that penthouse. The woman who remained was an architect of her own destiny. I walked toward the door, Stanton following closely behind. I stopped at the threshold, looking back at the two people who had given me life and then tried to take my identity. "The dinner was lovely, Diane," I said, my voice carrying a final, chilling clarity. "But I prefer my truth served cold. I'll see you both in court in 7 days. And don't worry about the staff. I've already authorized a payment for their wages from my personal reserve. Since Casey froze the corporate accounts, someone had to show them the kindness this family seems to have forgotten." As we stepped out into the crisp autumn night, the iron gates of the estate closing behind us, I felt a surge of explosive liberation. I climbed into Stanton's car, the leather seats feeling more like a sanctuary than that mansion ever had. Stanton didn't say a word for several minutes, allowing the silence to settle. Then, he handed me a tablet glowing with the morning's early stock market feed from the European exchanges. "Casey just signed the merger with the Chicago group," he said quietly. "Alaric Infrastructure just lost 12% of its value in 4 hours. The trap is officially sprung." I watched the red numbers scroll across the screen, my reflection in the glass finally looking back with a sense of complete, unburdened victory. Have you ever felt a moment when the wind finally shifts in your favor? I felt it then, and it was colder and more beautiful than I ever imagined. The Massachusetts Superior Court felt like a cathedral built for a god that demanded only the cold, unvarnished truth. High ceilings of dark oak trapped the hum of 100 restless souls, while the harsh fluorescent lights overhead stripped away the glamour of the Alaric name. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my back straight, wearing a navy suit that felt more like armor than silk. Across the aisle, Alaric and Casey sat huddled together. They exuded a desperate, expensive kind of confidence, the kind bought with a lawyer's hollow promises and a lifetime of getting their own way. I watched Casey lean in to whisper to our father, her eyes raking over my humble table. "She has no money left, Dad." Her voice drifted across the gap, sharp with a petty triumph. "This is just a last-ditch effort to beg for a settlement. Watch." I didn't respond to her bait. I simply looked at the mounting pile of evidence on the judge's bench and felt a wave of profound sorrow. It wasn't for myself, but for the legacy they were so eagerly dismantling. Truth is like water. You can try to dam it up or divert it, but eventually, it finds the cracks in your lies and washes everything away. Stanton leaned in close, his scent of peppermint and old law books a grounding force. "Are you ready, Zylah?" he whispered. I took a slow breath, the air in the courtroom tasting of dust and anticipation. "I'm not here to win, Stanton. I'm here to restore the foundation. When the truth is on your side, silence is your loudest witness. The proceedings began with a flurry of motion. Casey's lawyer stood with the practiced arrogance of a man used to bullying smaller firms. He argued that as the sole owner and CEO, Casey had every legal right to merge the company with the Chicago group. He painted me as a disgruntled, envious sibling attempting to sabotage a visionary transition. Alaric nodded along, his face set in a grim mask of approval. They were so certain of their victory that they didn't even notice Stanton standing up with a single blue-backed document. "Your Honor," Stanton's voice echoed through the chamber. "Before we discuss the merger, we must discuss the ownership of the debt that fuels it." He presented a notice of debt acquisition. The courtroom went silent. Casey's smirk faltered. Stanton revealed that while Casey had been busy spending corporate cash on a multi-million-dollar rebranding campaign and first-class flights, a private investment firm out of Chicago had been quietly buying up Alaric Infrastructure's predatory loans and delinquent vendor debts. That firm was wholly owned by me. I wasn't just a daughter being pushed out of a family business. I was now the primary secured creditor of Alaric Infrastructure. Under U.S. bankruptcy and commercial law, a primary creditor has the absolute right to halt any merger or asset transfer that threatens the collateral, which, in this case, was the very company Casey was trying to sell. I watched the blood drain from Alaric's face as Stanton produced the competency clause from my grandfather's original trust. The 12% drop in valuation Casey had caused in just 2 weeks hadn't just been a failure. It had been a legal trigger that automatically stripped her of her management power. I stood up then, my voice clear and carrying to the very back of the gallery. "Your Honor, I didn't buy this debt to destroy the company. I bought it to save it. My sister was handed a house and a title, but she was leading us into a merger that would have liquidated the pensions of 400 families. I am not here for an inheritance. I am here to protect the home of everyone who actually does the work." Shocked gasps rippled through the gallery, and I saw several board members lean back, their support for Alaric evaporating in real time. But the final blow was yet to come. Stanton produced the digital forensics from the laptop Casey had stolen from my apartment. The digital footprint was unmistakable. Casey had used my personal encrypted keys she could only have obtained by physical theft, to authorize a series of illegal offshore transfers to cover her personal credit card debts. It wasn't just corporate mismanagement. It was a felony. The judge didn't even wait for a rebuttal. He slammed the gavel down, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. His ruling was absolute and devastating. The transfer of the company, the family home, and the cash assets were declared void due to fraudulent inducement and a gross violation of fiduciary duty. Everything, the legacy, the bricks, and the gold, was ordered back to me as the only qualified successor under the grandfather's trust. I watched Alaric. His posture, once so imposing, simply shattered. He suffered a minor stress-induced collapse, his face turning a ghostly shade of gray as he was helped into a chair by his bailiffs. He looked like a stunted statue of a man who had realized too late that he had bet everything on the wrong daughter. Casey began to scream, a shrill, incoherent sound about unfairness and betrayal, until the judge threatened her with contempt and ordered her to be removed. I didn't look at the money. I didn't look at the deeds. I looked down at the weathered photo of my grandfather in my hand. Justice doesn't always feel like a celebration or a triumph. Sometimes, it just feels like the world finally stopped spinning the wrong way. I didn't take their lives. I just stopped pretending I was part of their lie. I had spent my life building things to last, and today, I had finally finished the most important structure of all, the truth. As I walked out of the courtroom, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind me, I found Diane kneeling by Alaric's side in the hallway. She looked up at me, and the mask of the sophisticated socialite was gone. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of terror and a sudden, pathetic kind of hope. She reached out a trembling hand, her voice a broken whisper. "Zylah, please. Casey is going to be arrested. The bank is taking everything that wasn't in the trust. You have everything now. You have to save us." I looked at her hand, then back at the courtroom doors. The 3-week clock had stopped, but the real work was only just beginning. The president's office at Alaric Infrastructure was flooded with the amber glow of a Boston sunset, the light stretching across the floor like a golden path I had spent half my life trying to find. I sat in the high-backed mahogany chair, the leather cool and firm beneath me. 2 days had passed since the gavel fell, and the frantic, shallow energy of Casey's short-lived reign had already evaporated. In its place was a focused, professional hum, the sound of a machine finally running on all cylinders. I wasn't celebrating. I was working. There were hundreds of millions in contracts to stabilize and 1,000 hearts to mend. I reached out and placed the weathered photo of my grandfather on the center of the desk. His eyes, fixed on a simpler time, seemed to watch me with a quiet, unyielding pride. My hands were steady as I signed the documents officially dismissing Casey's circle of incompetent consultants and reinstating the loyal project managers who had been purged. Inheritance is what people leave for you, but a legacy is what you build within others. I hadn't fought my way back here just to occupy a seat at the table. I had come back to make sure the table was still standing for the people who actually built the foundation. Stanton walked in, his footsteps muffled by the thick rug. He carried a leather portfolio containing the final transition deeds, his expression one of weary but profound satisfaction. I looked at the deed for the Beacon Hill mansion, its heavy paper feeling like lead in my hand. "Stanton, prepare the listing for the estate," I said, my voice clear and devoid of the old hesitation. "It's too large for 2 people who no longer have anything to say to one another. I've already selected a comfortable bungalow in the suburbs. It's smaller, quieter. They can learn to live with the truth there, instead of hiding behind an image." The heavy oak door swung open before Stanton could reply. Diane stood there, disheveled and weeping, her silk scarf trailing behind her like a tattered flag. She was no longer the sophisticated socialite I had known. She was a mother witnessing the total destruction of the child she had favored above all others. She didn't look at the office or the photo of my grandfather. She looked at me with a desperate, pathetic hope that turned my stomach. "You have everything now, Zylah," Diane cried, her voice cracking as she stumbled toward the desk. "The house, the money, the firm. Casey has nothing. She's facing 5 years in a federal prison because of those transfers. You've won. Isn't that enough? Please, you have to use your influence. Drop the charges. Tell the board it was an oversight. Save your sister. You are always the strong one, Zylah. You can handle this." I stood up slowly, the golden light catching the sharp lines of my suit. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Mom, you told me Casey deserved the inheritance because she was weak and fragile," I said, the words falling like stones into a still pond. "You are wrong. She deserved the chance to grow strong, but you smothered her with unearned privilege and lied to her until she believed she was above the consequences. I am not sending her to prison. Her own choices are. If I save her now, I am only repeating the sin you committed. I won't teach her that the law is just another thing she can ignore." Diane reached out a trembling hand, her tears smudging her expensive makeup. I walked around the desk and handed her a tissue, my touch firm but gentle. I felt a flicker of the old love, but it was anchored now to a boundary that would never again be crossed. "I have established a trust for your and Alaric's care," I told her, looking directly into her eyes. "You will never want for a roof or a doctor, but the keys to this office and the keys to my life stay with me. I forgive you for never seeing me, but I can no longer let your blindness lead my way. The door to that version of our family is closed." I watched Diane sink into a chair, her shoulders slumped in a final crushing defeat. I walked out of the office, the sound of the heavy door clicking shut behind me feeling like the final punctuation mark on a 30-year sentence. As I moved through the lobby, the staff didn't just move aside, they stood still, their nods filled with a genuine, deep-seated respect that Alaric had never managed to command. I walked out into the crisp air of the Boston Public Garden, the shadows of the elms lengthening across the grass. The greatest revenge isn't to mirror those who hurt you. It is to thrive so completely that their presence in your life becomes a footnote rather than a chapter. I sat on a bench near the swan boats, watching a young girl chase a squirrel while her parents watched with equal attention. I smiled at the horizon, the weight of the 3-week clock finally gone. I wasn't the overlooked daughter anymore. As the sun dipped below the skyline, a final notification appeared on my phone from an unknown number in Chicago. The project is yours, CEO. Let's build something that never breaks. I didn't look back at the office towers. I just walked forward into the cool, quiet evening. They thought they were taking my future, but they only freed me to build my own. Your worth isn't determined by those who fail to see it. It's built on the foundation of your own integrity.